प्रकाशित करने, राहों को आलोकित करने।
मैम को अगला पेज शुरू क्या कर लो दोनों
ठीक है। Good afternoon, learners. How are you? So today we will be covering chapter 6 in your syllabus, that is My Grandmother's House. Well, learners, before beginning with the chapter, let me give you an introduction of the poet. This poem was written by Kamala Das, who was born in Kerala. Kamala Das began her literary career like her mother as a short story writer in Malayalam. She, however, achieved wider recognition as an Indo-English poet with her widely read books like Summer in Calcutta, The Descendants, and The Voice Playhouse, and other poems. In her poem, learners, she reflects a feminine sensibility and feminist understandings. The writings of Kamala Das reflect the tensions of modern India and a quest, a desire for fulfillment. She questions, asserts, and defies through poetry. She also, defines the emotional experiences of a woman through her poetry. Kamala Das was noted for her many Malayalam short stories as well as many wonderful poems written in English. She was also a well-known newspaper columnist. The poem, learners, My Grandmother's House, is written by Kamala Das. The poem has been written in the memory of her grandmother, with whom she had spent her childhood with. The poet considers those moments to be the best moments of her life and desires to get them. She also mourns for the loss of those moments. So now, learners, I am sharing this picture of Kamala Das with you. So Kamala Das was an Indian English poetess as well as a leading Malayalam author from Kerala. Doesn't she look beautiful, learners? Look at her picture. Now let's begin with the poem. The poem My Grandmother's House is a wonderful creation by Kamala Das. She has written about her grandmother's house. She used to live with her grandmother in that house. Her grandmother's house was also very decent and very comfortable. There, she and her grandmother lived a very happy life. Everything, learners, around that very house was good. But when her grandmother died and the speaker lived in another place, the house became in a very bad and vulnerable condition. Everywhere in that house there was filth, and that house turned into a very pitiable, very sad conditions. Bushes grew around when the speaker once went there after her grandmother's death to see the house. Earlier when her grandmother was present, when she used to visit her grandmother, she was welcomed lovingly and warmly. But now she sees the house damaged. A strong feeling caught in her mind. She thinks that everything has changed in that house. Earlier, when she went there, she was proud of it. She loved it because she was received warmly. But now she is received by strangers at her grandmother's house. Well, learners, to begin with, this poem was published firstly in summertime in Calcutta in 1965. This poem is the autobiographical confessional poem. My Grandmother's House by Kamala Das is an emotional, poetic reflection of her unfulfilled desire to revisit her grandmother's ancestral house at Malabar in Kerala, where she had spent her memorable childhood. The poem also reveals the poet's constant pursuit and yearning for true love in life, or more closely, her continuous failure to discover sentimental intimacy through love. Despondent in the process, she's very despondent, she's very sad in the process of searching for love, while recollecting her childhood memories of her grandmother's ancestral home. Thus, simultaneously evokes pessimistic elements like wild despair, an armful of darkness, to contrast her present phase to the past, and to suggest the deficiency of happiness and bliss in her present unstable life. The poem, learners, captures suggestive visual imagery of blind eyes of windows and frozen air to convey the idea of death and desperation. So, learners, this poem has both it has both positive as well as negative imagery. And if you read the poem, you'll know that this poem throughout has a dominant tone of sadness, of melancholy, of despondence. If you look at, my grandmother's house, somewhere looked like the house that is shown on the screen. Totally ruined, totally dilapidated. This, even the windows are broken. It's a very pitiable, it's in a very sad condition. Learners, before beginning with the poem, let me throw some questions at you. Wear your thinking caps, learners, and try to think about what are the things your grandmother did for you when you were a child. What memories do you have of the time you spent with her? Now let's read the poem My Grandmother's House. The poet here in the poem remembers her grandmother and wishes that she were alive to love her, to make her feel wanted. Now let's read the poem together, learners. There is a house now far away where once I received love. That woman died. The house withdrew into silence. Snakes moved among books. I was then too young to read, but my blood turned cold like the moon. How often I think of going there to peer through blind eyes of windows, or just to listen to the frozen air, or in wild despair pick an armful of darkness to bring it here to lie. Behind my bedroom door, like a brooding dog, you cannot believe, darling. Can you that I lived in such a house and was proud and loved? I who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least in small change. So this is the beautiful poem written by Kamala Das. Now let's look at the analysis of the poem. Learners, let me remind you that now everybody has been put on mute. You can ask your doubts in the last 10 minutes of the session. Okay, learners? So, in the meantime, you just have to listen to me and you just have to think. Or if you want to ask something, you can put your questions in the chat section. Okay, so we've read the poem. Now let's go through the analysis. Well, learners, the first part of the poem, My Grandmother's House, shows intense love and attachment to it. Poet's intense love and attachment to the grandmother's house. She suffers from an acute sense of alienation after having left this place after her marriage. The poet now lives in a big city after her marriage, a remote place from her grandmother's house. She is reminded of her grandmother's house where she spent her memorable childhood. Ironically, it is the only place where she received love from her grandmother. The death of the grandmother is even mourned by the house to which she was emotionally attached to. A death-like silence reigned in the house after her exit from the world. It seems that the grandmother was the very soul of the house. Being deserted, the snakes could be seen among books in the library of the house. At that point in time, she was too young to read those books, which looked quite horrible and repulsive like snakes now. She was almost frozen with fear at the passing away of her grandmother, and she seemed like the cold moon. The very opening lines of the poem, learners, capture alive poet's mood of nostalgia. She is reminded of the happiest days of her childhood, which she spent in the company of her grandmother. She was deeply attached to her grandmother, who was very caring and affectionate to her. But after her death, learners, the poet Kamala Das became destabilized. She lost her mental balance because she was almost heartbroken after her grandmother's death. It was her disenchantment with her loveless marriage that reminded her of her grandmother's pure and selfless love. If we look at the second part of the poem, learners, My Grandmother's House, the poet defines her relationship with her grandmother in a very moving manner in this part. Kamala Das in this part is reminded of the happiest days of her childhood, which she spent with her grandmother. The poet was deeply attached to her grandmother, who was very caring and affectionate to her. She was emotionally shattered after the death of her grandmother, who had been the chief source of inspiration in her life. The poet often longed to visit her grandmother's house, to which she was emotionally attached since her childhood. It has been a place of security and protection, which is sadly missing in her new house in the city. She would like to peep through the dust-ridden or colored panes of windows that were shut after the death of the grandmother. She would like to listen and feel the still atmosphere prevailing in the air. It is this longing, learners, to revisit her grandmother's house that adds to her sense of frustration and hopelessness. The darkness of her grandmother's house can have no terrifying impact on her. She would like to gather some darkness, some memories of her grandmother's house and bring them to her present city residence. The very memories of her grandmother's house will have a soothing impact on her loveless and hopeless married life. In this part, learners, the poet is in a constant state of nostalgia, of reminiscence, and recreates the plight of the grandmother's house after her departure from life. She gives us, the readers, a sense, the feel of the house in the state of neglect and desertion. The poet has always, in the poem, learners, if you look at the poem closely, the poet has used, literary devices like similes and metaphors also. She has employed suggestive and visual imagery like blind eyes of the windows and the frozen air to convey the idea of death and desperation. In the third part, if you look at the third part, learners, some last concluding lines, you will know that here the poet says about her frustration and her disenchantment in her marital life, which actually forces her to seek love and to seek happiness outside marriage. The poet often longs to visit her grandmother's house, to which she was emotionally attached since her childhood. Unlike her miserable city life with her husband, it had always been a place of security and genuine love for her. Here the poet informs her dear husband that he can never believe the intensity of love that she received from her grandmother. He can never realize that she was extremely proud of her grandmother's house, where she was deeply loved by her grandmother. It is her separation from her grandmother's house after marriage that has ruined her life forever. It is love, she blames her marriage, she blames her loveless and hopeless married life that has crippled her sense of pride and love, which she used to have in her grandmother's house. She has become a beggar for love who knocks helplessly at strangers' doors to receive at least in a small measure. She has almost lost her way in search of genuine and selfless love. Learners, in the poem, Kamala Das exposes the vacuum of, the emptiness of loveless and hopeless marital relationships. The poem also shows, if you look at the poem carefully, learners, the poem also shows the agony, the humiliation, the rejection, the dejection of a married woman who is forced to seek, love outside marriage just to satisfy her emotional satisfaction. In the poem, if you look at the poem, it is the mood of nostalgia, of reminiscence that dominates the closing phase of the poem. The poet is reminded of her grandmother's house where she received love and safety in her childhood. She has lost all her identity and freedom in her loveless marriage. Now we have discussed the analysis. Now learners, I want all of you to sit with your notebooks and write some important points from the poem. Kamala Das wrote an autobiographical poem called My Grandmother's House. She recounts the terrible and pitiful state of her grandmother's house as well as the state of her own life. Her grandmother had passed away. She was all by herself. When she visited her old residence, she recalls her history. The house presently is in a very vulnerable state. The poet recalls a period when she was a youngster and could enjoy love in a safe and secure environment. She contrasts this happy existence with her current position, which is devoid of affection. The speaker, learners, reflects on the past, describing a house that still exists but is distant in her mind. This was her grandmother's house that she adored. Grandmother was the only source of happiness and warmth in that house. And when she died, learners, the entire house fell silent. Nature entered in the shape of a snake, a symbol of danger and coldness. Slithering through the books, a revealing scene may be significant to the speaker. The poet wonders if she could bring the memories of her grandmother's house to her bedroom door like a brooding dog. The poet is constantly comparing her childhood experiences with her present world of human nature. She says that earlier she lived in a house where she was honored and loved, but now, learners, she feels lost. The poet desires to bring these pleasant sentiments into her bedroom where she is now residing. She wishes to have this darkness in her bedroom for the rest of her life in order to relive the memories of the past. Though the poet had experienced love in the past, she had lost it all in the present. She seeks affection and is willing to beg for it at the doors of strangers. Learners, she has a desire to rekindle the love. This contrast and comparison of then and now, past and present, generates tension in this poem and provides the reader with a clear image of how the poet's circumstances have changed. Learners, now, like we have discussed the important points also, can you tell me the message of the poem? What is the message of the poem, learners? Well, learners, My Grandmother's House is a poem about, the poet's yearning, the poet's, feeling, her emotional feeling, her emotional desire for the emotions that she felt in her grandmother's house, where she was very happy and secured. The poem is about poet's childhood memories. She shows her immense love towards her grandmother. The poem wraps within itself a sense of nostalgia and quest for love. Poet says that her grandmother's home was a place where she felt secure and loved. But after her grandmother's death, the house is frozen with silence. Now, learners, let's look at some literary devices in the poem. Well, majorly, learners, there are two literary devices in the poem. The first is simile and second is metaphor. Well, learners, what is simile? Well, simile is a figure of speech that expresses resemblance between two similar things. Now, in the poem, my blood turned cold like the moon. It is an example of simile. Lie behind my bedroom door like a brooding dog. This is also an example of simile. Now, learners, what is metaphor? Well, metaphor is a figure of speech in which an expression is used to refer to something that it does not literally denote in order to suggest a similarity. In the poem, example of metaphor is to peer through blind eyes of windows. So there are two literary devices used in the poem, simile and metaphor. Now, learners, let's look at some themes in the poem. Well, the first theme is recollection from the past. Nostalgia is the first theme. The major theme of the poem is about reminiscing about one's childhood. The poet is in disagreement with her present and is trying to console herself by looking back at her childhood when she was living with her grandmother. So she is constantly remembering her grandmother, constantly recollecting her memories from the past. So the first theme is recollection from the past, from her childhood days. Next theme, learners, is the constant need and the begging of love. Okay, the need for love. Well, here in this theme, the poet describes her time with her grandmother as the time when she was loved and proud of it. A person's constant need for love and its varying degree of disappointment is displayed here in the poem. She's begging for love, and even if you look at the concluding lines, you'll know that she is in conversation with her husband also, where she longs for the love from her husband. She wants the same love and the same feeling of, wantedness, what she felt with her grandmother. She has lost her grandmother, so she begs for love at strangers' doors. She knows well that she won't be able to get that much amount of love, but still she hopes for it. She hopes that even if she doesn't get the love that her grandmother, gave her, but still she hopes that at least she can get a part of it, a small part of love. She's begging for love throughout the poem. Hence, the poem can also be about hope and despair. So, the third theme is despair. The speaker here is in despair. The poet, she's sad because she feels that she has lost her way after her grandmother's death. Earlier, she must have been too certain of herself, but now she begs for love at strangers' doors. And they are not at all like her grandmother. So, the third theme is of despair. The fourth theme, learners, is of desire. The poet expresses her desire to go to her grandmother's house because she's emotionally attached to it and she emotionally misses her grandmother. She wants to look through the blind eyes or windows of her grandmother. The line, learners, the phrase, the blind eyes of windows, means that there is no one in the house to look for. She also desires to listen the frozen air of that house. Frozen air, learners, means that the house is locked for many, many years and the fresh air does not move in it. So that is why the phrase frozen air has been used in the poem. The fifth theme in the poem is family relationship. The bond between grandmother and granddaughter is vividly portrayed in the poem. There is lot of obvious affection between the two. The poet also shares, some poignant moments from her childhood as well as, what she's feeling presently. The memories of the past act as a bond between her grandmother and her past and her present. Whatever she's remembering, whatever memory she has of her past, she's constantly comparing it with her present state. She is not close to her husband as she was close to her grandmother. So the fifth theme, family relationships, is very important. Now, learners, before pursuing with the rest of the chapter, before getting on further, learners, let's take a short break.
प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने, जीवन ये प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने, हम अपना दीपक स्वयं बने, हम अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने, अपना दीपक स्वयं बने, हम अपना जीवन ये प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने। धन साधन समय की सीमा से विद्यालय जो मुक्त हो, कभी पढ़े हम कहीं पढ़े बेविषय की लोच से युक्त हो, कभी पढ़े हम कहीं पढ़े बेविषय की लोच से युक्त हो। मित्रों हम उठे और जागे, मंजिल आने की ध्वनि सुने, अपना जीवन स्वयं बने हम, अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने। जीवन ये प्रकाशित करने, राहों को आलोकित करने। राष्ट्रीय मुक्त विद्यालय का है द्वार खुला सबकी खातिर।
शिक्षा परीक्षा का अवसर एक बार ही क्यों मिलता फिर।
शिक्षा परीक्षा का अवसर एक बार ही क्यों मिलता फिर। दुनिया में इसके केंद्र बात, कोई मन चाहा केंद्र चुने, हम अपना जीवन स्वयं बने हम, अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने। कोई मन चाहा केंद्र चुने, स्वयं बने हम,
Hello learners, welcome back. So before the break, we were discussing the themes of the poem My Grandmother's House. So let me revise the poem one more time with you. Well, My Grandmother's House is a poem written by Indian poet Kamla Das. The poem first appeared in an anthology of verse entitled Summertime in Calcutta. It is an autobiographical poem in which the speaker's nostalgic desire for her grandmother's home reflects through the inability to visit the happy past. The poem describes the speaker's happy life before her grandmother's death and sad life after her grandmother's death. The speaker of the poem is a married woman. She is reminded of a parental home, which is the symbol of immense love. The poem describes the clear difference between past and present. In past, the life was full of activity, whereas now it has turned into deadly silence. The intensity of sadness is expressed by dark and negative energy. Kamla Das learners, like I had told you before, is one of the three most popular Indian poets in India. Her poetry is all about herself, her deeply felt desire for love, her emotional involvement, and her inability to achieve such a friendship. In the poem My Grandmother's House, Kamla Das remembers her ancestral home and her deceased grandmother. The poem takes the form of a confession that contrasts her current fractured state with that of being unconditionally loved by her grandmother. Now let's look at some important words from the text. The word despair in the poem means being sad without hope. Frozen means cold. Brooding means to worry about something. Peer means to look at something carefully. Armful learners means the quantity that can be contained in the arms. Now, let me throw some questions at you. Okay, and you can write your answers in the chat section. So the first question, learners, what happened to the house? What happened to the grandmother's house after she died? Tell me, learners, what happened to the grandmother's house after she died? Okay, so the grandmother's house withdrew into silence. Its situation worsened. Okay, it got ruined. Next question, learners. Why was the poet not be able to read books when she lived with her grandmother? When the poet lived with her grandmother, learners, why couldn't she read books? Because, yes, very good, because she was too young to read any book. Now, look at this question, learners. The poet wants to go back to the house to peer dash, to listen dash, to pick dash. The poet wants to go back to the house to peer dash, to listen dash, to pick dash. Okay, the poet wants to go back to the house to peer through the blind eyes of the windows, means to look through the blind eyes of the window, to listen to the frozen air, and to pick an armful of darkness. Learners, what do you understand by an armful of darkness? 3 options have been given to you. What do you understand by an armful of darkness? Is it answer 1, 2 or 3? Which is the correct option, learners? In the poem, an armful of darkness means the old memories of the grandmother's house. Next question, learners. To lie behind my bedroom door like a brooding dog. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by the phrase to lie behind my bedroom door like a brooding dog? What do you understand by this phrase? Well, this phrase means the first option is correct. The memories will always remain with the poet. Next question, learners. The poet thinks of her past. How is her present different from the past? Tell me, learners. I repeat the question. The poet thinks of her past. How is her present different from the past? She remembers her childhood, she remembers her childhood in her grandmother's house when she was loved. She had a deep, she was very happy when she was living with her grandmother in the past. But now she has a deep sense of sorrow because she feels that nobody loves her. So her present state is full of sadness while her past is full of happiness. Next question, learners. Why are the eyes of the windows described as blind? Tell me, why are the eyes of the windows described as blind? Well, the eyes of the windows are described as blind because the windows are dusty and nobody can see through them. Next, why is the air in the grandmother's house defined as frozen? Why is the air in the grandmother's house is frozen? Well, because nobody entered that house for a very long time. So the house has become very silent and very lonely. The house is frozen due to silence and loneliness. Okay, learners. Okay. So, if you have any doubts, you can unmute yourselves and you can ask me your doubts. Okay, yes, Kirti Rathore, if you have a doubt. Okay, so let me conclude the lesson. The poet recalls the house where she once used to live with her grandmother, who was very fond of her and from whom she used to receive a lot of love. The grandmother had died and the house had then stopped to be inhabited by anybody. The poet in those days was a little girl and did not even know how to read the books which lay in the house. The death of her grandmother had made the little girl lose her capacity to feel. It had seemed to her that the blood in her veins was no longer warm but had turned cold as the moon. The poet, learners, now often thinks of going to that house in order to look at the things inside it through the windows. but the windows being closed, she would not be able to see anything lying inside and would be able only to experience a feeling of utter hopelessness, and then to gather some of the darkness from that place and bring it with her to her bedroom, where she would merely lie down to meditate upon her memories of the past. Addressing her husband, learners, Kamala Das says that he would perhaps not be able to believe that she had lived in such a loving and such a secured house. She feels proud of herself. She feels proud of her past. Currently, she no longer receives any love from anybody. So she's seeking love like a beggar from strangers. And she thinks that she will be consoled even if she, gets a small measure of love from somebody. She's desperate for love. She's seeking for love. She's seeking for the same amount of love that she got from her grandmother, but her husband is failing her in providing her love. Now, if you look at the central idea, learners, let me just conclude the class today and let me take you through the central idea of the poem. Well, the central idea of the poem, My Grandmother's House, is basically longing for the past. Poet is longing for her happy days that she spent with her grandmother. She was so proud. She was so proud of it. She felt so loved. So basically, learners, the central idea of the poem is the poet's longing for love and the failure to achieve it. Now, I'm ending the class, and before ending the class, learners, can you see the question? I just want to throw these questions to you so that at home you can, answer these questions and reflect your understanding of today's class. The first question, learners, after the death of the poet's grandmother, what happened to the house? What happened to the house after the death of poet's grandmother? Next question, why is the air in grandmother's house described as frozen? Third question, the house is silent. No one lives there. Even the air doesn't seem to be moving. Explain this in your own words. And lastly, learners, I hope everybody should be able to answer this. What do you think is the message of the poem? What is the poet trying to convey through the poem? Okay, learners, this is it for... Yes? What was the main meaning of? So basically, here, the poet Kamala Das, she's desiring for the love that, she misses her grandmother's love. She misses her grandmother's house. That feeling of nostalgia is there in the poem. Okay, Anvi? Okay. Okay, learners, this is it for today. See you next time. Please answer these questions. Thank you for listening.